So when we look at the ROSE test, the ROSE test definition is resistivity, that's our R, of is our O, solvent is the key point there. Then E, of course, is our extract. So what I kind of want to try to explain a little bit in layman's terms is that the solvent portion of that. So solvent is, if I remember anything from my chemistry days, which were a long time ago, maybe not quite as long as yours, but a long time ago.
Hey there, watch that.
But it was, like dissolves like. So therefore, when we look for a solvent, we look for something that is basically will easily dissolve what we're trying to measure. I know I've heard you tell me this several times before that we can do a ROSE test with almost any solvent. We can do it with diesel fuel, gasoline. There are different chemistries out there in the electronics industry that as long as we can measure.
It's nice that the solvent has a little polarity to it, but a lot of solvents have polarity. I mean, alcohols, water, esters, all kinds of things with oxygens in the compound.
With a ROSE test, in layman's terms, you can really run a ROSE test with almost any solvent.
Right.
Okay. So the IPC standard that some, not so many nowadays, but in the older days, and I think it's kind of going extinct from what I understand and what I'm reading, they have a set ROSE test that they use specific to the industry. Is that correct?
That is correct, and it's based upon the old military standard, MIL-P 22809, which came out in the late 60s, and that's where the first test was identified. The mil specs went away in the 90s because we didn't want the military telling us how to build our stuff anymore. They just tell us what it had to meet. So then it became the industry's responsibility to take that test and turn it into a standard test, now called the IPC standard ROSE test.
The IPC has recently started reevaluating how we use the ROSE test.
That's right.
So biggest portion that has changed here recently on the way they use it is that you can no longer use an IPC sanctioned ROSE test as a product validation, so a process validation. So in other words, if you have a new product that you're building, you can't say that it goes through this process and I did a ROSE test on it, so that means it's clean. There's several other things. We won't get into any of that due to time, but there's several other ways that you can qualify a process now. But the biggest thing to point out is the only way to, once you've established your process, the only way to monitor that process in a real-time, efficient, and cost-efficient way is with a ROSE test. So the current ROSE test standard, the IPC ROSE test standard, says that you have to select one board once per shift, and then as long as that passes, then that means that we're assuming that everything else you run for the day has passed.
The IPC way is now coming about is not to use the ROSE test as a pass-fail for a single board, but to use it as a process control test. When I was testing boards, I didn't want to just pull one board out and test it. I wanted to test every board in that entire lot that I cleaned every single time I cleaned a batch. But it wasn't practical because you couldn't run alcohol in there. I couldn't run that test. But as a chemist, I figured out you don't have to run alcohol in there. You just have to run a solvent that's going to dissolve that residue. And be it detergent residue, flux residue, or finger soils, water is the best solvent. So in this machine right here, we've replaced the alcohol from the ROSE test with water, and we test every single batch. After we rinse it and verify the rinse is proper and wash it properly, we run a ROSE test following that, and we can give you a value that tells you if your board is on average passing a standard or failing a standard, or more importantly, whether the average is trending up, more dirty, or the average is trending down, more clean. So we want to go towards more clean. So that is really process control versus the pass-fail that we've used for the last 30 years for this test. That's obsolete now. The best way to go now is build it into the machine, use it with the solvent that you're rinsing with, and do your ROSE test in the machine on every single batch. That's the way of the future. And unless you're bound by a contractual requirement that requires you to pull a single board out and test it, there's really no reason for that.